Thank you and welcome to the final session of today, which marks over the halfway point in the whole conference, actually. Today has been about, and I just remind you again, about art, its discourses, and the world at large. And I think that's a topic that both of our final two speakers before the plenary session are actually going to address themselves to. David Riff, who's furthest away from me, is an art critic and writer, a member of the work group Sur Delat, and was co-editor of the newspaper of the same name from 2003 to 2008. Riff currently teaches art history at the Rodchenko School of Photography in Moscow. He contributed a text to the monograph Back, recently published on the work of Mona Vatamanu and Florin Tudor, and writes regularly on post-Soviet contemporary art in publications such as Documenta 12 magazines, Moscow Art Magazine, Rethinking Marxism, Springerin, and Third Text. Riff is also an accomplished translator and is active in artistic collaborations. Together with Dmitry Gutov, he contributed to the 52nd Venice Biennale in 2007 with the long-term project, the Karl Marx School of the English Language. David Riff lives and works in Moscow. And nearest to me is Jalal Toufic, who is a thinker and writer. Since 2007, he's professor at the Department of Communication Design at Kadir Has University in Istanbul. Previously, he taught at the universities of California at Berkeley, the Cal Arts, and the USC Los Angeles. He's also been present in this country at Das Arts and at the Rijksakademie. He's the author of many books, of which I will only give a brief selection. The Withdrawing of Tradition Past the Surpassing Disaster, which I think we will refer to in the talk. Undeserving Lebanon in 2007, Ashura, This Blood Spilled in My Veins 2005, and Two or Three Things I'm Dying to Tell You, also 2005. Toufic lives and works in Istanbul. And the talk, which we've been rather discussing in a kind of spirit of singularity, we'll do it in a slightly different way to some of the previous talks, in that I'll join them on the stage and try to facilitate the conversation, and then we'll roll, hopefully fairly seamlessly, into a plenary session afterwards, in which I'll ask the other speakers to join us. The two talks, David will talk more specifically about a very simple question: what can the former East offer to the former West? And Jalal will look perhaps broader in terms of the withdrawal of tradition after a surpassing disaster. So if I could ask you to start. Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. And I have to say that here we have a little illustration for one thing that was said yesterday about neurotics and psychotics. You see before you a typical neurotic who has thrown away his paper, decided to speak freely, and I don't know, do you consider yourself a psychotic? Or
On that side, yes.
Yeah, okay, so for the purposes of this discussion, we have this situation. The reason I threw my paper away last night is because I began to agonize over the question that Sarat Maharaj raised, which is, what does the former East have to offer the former West? And somehow began trying to locate myself in that situation. Actually, this is a kind of neurotic work that began as soon as I was told about the existence of this conference. And like all of you probably, I'm trying the whole time to figure out, what is this former West, what is this former East, where does my location as someone who is probably already the former West, in the sense that I have left the West in some sense, and where is Russia? Is Russia the former East? I think it's not. I think it is actually still the East. The former East to me would be, for an example, Eastern Europe, the countries of Eastern Europe that have joined the EU, that are being integrated also on a state level in terms of art programs, where there are venues for, let's say, a real communication that's going on with Western Europe. I think that Russia is still a place that is very much far away. Although it's lost, there has been a rupture. And I would like to today talk a little bit about the effects that occur between these two places. And maybe also try to kind of give you a sense of the formerness of a different type, not of the formerness of let's say, someone who has memories before 1989 and memories of a professional life before 1989 that changed definitively, but somebody who really also came to the art world after 1989 and has been working in this situation that we have now, or that's been emerging now. But one thing that I think I'd like to start with is to draw all of your attention to the following. In the last 2 days, we've heard a lot about Magicien de la Terre as being an important point of reference and the beginning of a conversation on, or a real discourse on post-colonialism. As Okoye and Wenzer pointed out, this was not the first exhibition that did it, but it was really an event on a global scale somehow that has an entire mythology around it. I find it very interesting that shortly before this conference in Moscow there was the third Moscow Biennial, which was a remake of Magicien de la Terre. It was curated by Jean-Hubert Martin. It took place in a very interesting new institution called the Garage, which is owned or operated, I should say, by Dasha Zhukova. She's the girlfriend of Roman Abramovich, an oligarch. This show, so already we immediately have the laughter that comes. I was about to make another joke, actually, to ask what can the former East offer other than money from Russian oligarchs. This was another thing that was mentioned yesterday. But what was interesting about this was you had certainly the sense at that biennial, which was received in an ambivalent way in Moscow, that a moment of the former West, and something that is really by now already former, is being brought to Russia in a kind of policy, in a conscious policy of dealing with belated catching up revolution development, that an image of what could start a post-colonial discussion now comes almost at the end of this discussion, or at a midpoint in this discussion, and is being presented as something radically new, as a call to civic responsibility perhaps, as a call to be more aware of other cultures in Russia, which is, as the curator assumed, as Jean-Hubert Martin assumed, and I think he's right, a very conservative society with many issues on how to actually deal and look at art from elsewhere other than Western Europe and Russia. This was maybe the intention, but the situation that came up there was quite different from what was intended. It was a very popular show. It had about 100,000 visitors, which for Moscow is an extreme amount. But I think it was charming, interesting to a Moscow audience for many of the wrong reasons. It presented, I would say, a kind of zoo with many stuffed animals, live animals, many, I would say, consciously exoticist presentations of art, not only from the post-colonial world, the former Rest, as was said yesterday, but also by formerly Western artists. This was presented as a kind of pleasant, universal image of creation that was shown to a creation, meaning a kind of something that had already evaded the dispositive of what art is in a kind of traditional Western way, where you could have all kinds of different things that would all be subsumed under the rubric of a universal human creativity. And it was really not perceived as a signal, I think, by most people to think about the serious problems that a post-colonial discourse would today involve. Instead, it was perceived as I would say, a call to multiculturalism almost, of the kind that one could see in the immediate aftermath of 1989. And I think that's very interesting because this is really an image of the former West that's being transplanted into the present East. Okay, I think that this is so. What the one thing the former East or the East can offer the former West, as it historically is always the case, is a kind of projective surface, to come a few seconds or even 20 years later, and to show what this West actually was. And I don't think that this is the only thing that the former East or the East has to offer. There's another thing that it definitely has to offer, which is an image of renewed primitive accumulation. I think that what we've seen over the last 20 years, and I'm really surprised that no one has mentioned this so far, people have talked a lot about transitions from one mode of production to another, talked about technological transition, transition of temporality, like in the last panel, the last conversation about a replacement of historical time with cyclical time. But we haven't talked about this really central moment of primitive accumulation that is taking place over the last 20 years, of a renewed, as David Harvey calls it in his book on the new imperialism, renewed accumulation through expropriation, through dispossession. This is something that definitely happened in Russia in the course of the privatizations of the 1990s. A process that was often violent, socially violent. The communities of late Soviet life that really constituted the fabric of society. If you imagine late Fordist institutions crumbling and communities, small communities inhabiting them, really forming the fabric of what was going on in the late Soviet time, where the bounds of these communities were torn asunder. Property was radically redistributed and placed in the hands of actually very few people. And all of this was accompanied by what Marx called an ideal subsumption under capital. I should say ideal because, in a sense, life was continuing as it was. It was falling apart, but it was continuing. Capitalism, as a real defining force of the everyday, had not yet entered the field. So in the 1990s, you could really see these on a level of ideology as well, a kind of apology for capitalism and an enacting of what the new freedoms of this new time would be, but that were very much the individualist enactings of how you could appropriate from all kinds of different traditions to build a kind of wonderful postmodernist reflection of yourself as a cultural producer. But you didn't really see much reflection on what was actually going on, which was this incredible redistribution of property. You could see reflections of it and enactments of it in radical practices that were supposedly resisting this process. But they were more like almost mirrorings and enactments of the same violence that was going on. I'm referring to this Moscow actionism of the 1990s, a very radical art that was taking place outside of institutions, definitively outside of institutions, other than those in very ephemeral locations that were popping up around Moscow, and that were being only brought to the West as representations, as, for an example, Julian Stalabras argues in his book, as representations of this new wild East. I think that it's very interesting that phase that you see, this very radical phase where there are no art institutions that we could speak of in the sense of Western Europe, where there are no art schools. So you have to realize that, for an example, a school as the kind of at which I teach, called the Rodchenkov School for Photography and Media, or media art, is actually one of the closest things that we have to an art school. So there's no museum of contemporary art, and only now do we see the emergence of such institutions. So this is all taking place in a completely non-institutional context, where self-organization is not something that you opt for because you don't want to be inside the institution, where it's something that you are forced into, and where you are self-organizing, and where there are also older forms of self-organization that are actually being broken apart by the force of capitalism. Because as we know, and I think this is something that everyone has experienced, not only in the former East, the former West, the former Rest, and anywhere where there's humanity. When we see these capitalist relations being introduced, there's an incredible atomization of society and of communities that were once existing. I think we even see this in the art world among people who are trying to escape and then are in a community or in a micro-community somehow working together. That community is broken apart by the relations of production of a capitalist society. So it's interesting to ask, actually, and this touches upon what you were saying yesterday, is what actually was being broken up? And is it something positive to refer to? Can we, for an example, speak about an anti-politics, a parallel politics, a civil enthusiasm? I could add to this another lovely word, which is the German Zivilcourage, that was kind of exhibited in 1989, supposedly. And can we refer back to that and say, okay, we are the new dissidents? This is a discussion that we had in Stodiel. It's a newspaper that we've been publishing with a group of friends, comrades, since 2003. And from the very beginning, we tried to ask, how can we actualize this dissident legacy? And I have to say that my position was always definitely no, or at least not without working through the contradictions of what those communities actually were and how they actually worked. I think maybe some of you picked up on this yesterday. It was a question that my colleague Katja Djogot asked, and that sort of showed that things maybe are not so simple. There's a big contradiction between, on the one hand, an anti-communism, an ideological anti-communism that you can see not only in an intellectual sphere, not only among educated people, but that really runs straight through society by now. But on the other hand, you see something very different, namely on the level of practice, people who grew up in a socialist context, and I, as someone who didn't grow up in a socialist world, always noticed this right away, that they are actually sometimes practicing as if they were, and speaking and arguing as if they were Marxists. This to me was always a big, big contradiction that I tried to come to terms with and try to understand as something that one really has to work through, and one has to see how this contradiction generates something that almost anticipates privatization. Royce yesterday spoke about an invention of one's own past. I think that that may be a mistake in the sense that the Moscow conceptualists, for an example, artists who were really working in that contradiction and feeling its tension, were actually already producing material artifacts, and on the level of a material practice, were really anticipating the privatizations to come. So this I think, is a big topic, and something we should be discussing more, is in how far are these contradictions there, and how do we have to work through them? How can we avoid idealizing an anti-politics, for an example, that is actually fraught with a very different problem, which is actually maybe this anti-communism was a mistake in the ideological way that it was made. Maybe that was the real idealism, and that was the real failure. Because in the end what happened is that many people who were living in that contradiction then contributed to this process of privatization, became its agents, and really managed to tear up the community that they were living in. So it's actually a universe that can't last for more than 2 days to sit in that contradiction. So this is the one thing that I wanted to say. Another thing I wanted to say is that actually, if you look at this model of primitive accumulation and that Marx proposes as something, of course, this is something we would have to problematize. Marx postulates that this is something that happens only once. At the rosy dawn of capital, as he says, he's arguing with Adam Smith. He's saying that there's nothing idyllic about the dawn of capitalism. There's maybe something emancipating, but it only comes after an epoch of violence and of basically expropriation. And he identifies this difference between real subsummation under capitalism, ideal subsummation under capitalism, and real subsummation. After this phase of the 1990s, and this is another thing that we haven't talked about at all, came the 2000s. And the 2000s in Russia really were a phase of a real subsummation of everyday life under capitalism. Suddenly you had a definite turn and a definite sense that the legacy of the Soviet Union was somehow really disappearing. And there was, I think, a very strong artistic reaction to this change, this sea change. If in the 1990s you had very ephemeral, radical practices coming out of an actionist frame, largely, and you had conceptualist practices that were being introduced in the West but that weren't really continuing in Moscow, in the 2000s, actually, there was a big change in the sense that people really turned away from the radicalism of the previous years, a radicalism that maybe could be quite suspect, yeah? For the reason that it's actually just mirroring the violence of primitive accumulation. What you see now is a turn to, I would say, and here comes another thing, that how the former or the East can offer, again, a projective surface. They began to turn, of all people, to Clement Greenberg. Suddenly Clement Greenberg became maybe a more significant art theorist than, let's say, even Guy Debord, as it was in the 1990s. This was a central figure of reference, yeah? More even than Adorno, for example, who was also being received. But it was really Clement Greenberg and his essay Autonomy and Kitsch that suddenly heralded a new time, a time where people would be painfully aware of the tug of the golden umbilical cord pulling them toward this garage of Dasha Zhukova somehow, yeah? I mean, I'm sorry to be so negative and to be so critical about the Russian context, but I really think it's necessary to make those clarifications and to show that actually, while things are happening, because I think that this is something that we haven't spoken about in the context of the former West. I think we can talk about the 1990s also in the former West as a very radical time, as a time where things are really, where the boundaries of art are really dissolving, where there are new organizational forms emerging. As suspect as they might be, they also have to do, and suspect because they also have to do with expropriation. They also have to do with a not so non-violent transition. They have to do with massive deindustrialization, with a real change also in the way that intellectuals, cultural workers, to use this difficult turn of phrase, are dealing with their surroundings. But in the 2000s, I think there is also a sea change here. I think there's something that one could. On the one hand, one could talk about a new institutionalism. On the other hand, one could talk about a normalization. And I find it interesting that in books that you read about the Western context, about the former Western context, you find conceptualizations of a normalization. And this is exactly the term that was being used in Russia in parallel to talk about the introduction of authoritarian one-party rule under Putin and the establishing of institutions, but institutions that would be under quite strict control somehow. Yeah? I think now we see the continuation of this normalization, and the question is how far does it continue, how does it go, where does it go, and what can you do under these circumstances? And I think that's almost where I would. I don't know how long I've been speaking. I'm fine, so I could go on for a bit. Okay. Now, when this sea change began to occur, actually, this is when I came to the Russian art world. So I wasn't involved so much in the 1990s. I heard about it, I read about it, but it was definitely very far away. It was the former East somehow enacting the transition to something else that was a situation of great instability and unclarity somehow. But when I came to the Russian context, this was what was going on, and it's interesting that we founded the newspaper Что делать exactly at that point. In 2003, I think this was really the beginning of that normalization. We immediately began to go very quickly through this kind of attempting to do exactly what had been done here in the 1990s, actually. We were trying somehow to constitute a self-organizing practice. We were trying to be interdisciplinary. We had a utopia that philosophers could make art and that artists could philosophize, that all of us could be very critical and political together, and precisely by abolishing the divisions of labor. We began very quickly to read and to pump ourselves full of theory. I have to say that post-colonial theory there was too little of. Feminist theory there was more of. Most of it was, I would say, a general kind of critical theory, but one that, unlike the kind of critical theory that was being imported into Russia in the 1990s, wasn't neutralized politically, wasn't somehow decapitated, almost, I would say. And I think that is also a problem that one could talk about with the former East. Yeah? That critical theory was introduced, but that it was introduced as something that already had no relevance to these processes of expropriation, for an example, that I'm talking about. And at some point, and this is what I find quite interesting, our practice sort of began to develop into the direction of, at least, I mean, for me, into the direction of actually going a bit further back. For some members of Что делать, it was going back to the avant-garde and really trying to formulate practices that would refer back to a Soviet legacy that wasn't so much the dissident legacy, but really the Soviet avant-garde legacy, trying to actualize these things, trying to problematize what happens under in conditions of contemporary production with these ways of working. For me, it was even, I think, stronger, a pull back to the 19th century suddenly under these conditions of normalization. Not only because Moscow somehow is reminiscent, or the former East, or the East is reminiscent now of a kind of Napoleon III situation politically, but also because it has a kind of Biedermeier silence that's developing in society that I really was uncomfortable with, and at the same time I took as a kind of impetus to internalize, to interiorize the critique, our own critique, to become very self-critical, and to suddenly ask myself, what right actually do I have to call myself a Marxist? I read Marx when I was 19 or 20 in German, and it was a long time ago, and actually I'm now reading Deleuze and Foucault, and maybe I should actually be reading Marx. And I began somehow in the mid-2000s to do this, and I wasn't. I think this is an aside and a kind of anecdote. I think that it's interesting that throughout all of these attempts to be very critical, to be very political, we sort of had always the situation that there was a Marxism of practice, a Marxism, an unconscious legacy of Marxism-Leninism, but that Marx as a writer, Marx as a philosopher, was actually occluded from these practices, that no one was really reading these texts. So I kind of almost want to end with a Marxist on a Marxist fundamentalist note. I think that it's very useful under those kind of circumstances where an autonomy of art is being reintroduced, where you really have the commodity form being shown to you in such a clear way that here often is diluted. It's a very useful impulse to go back and to read these texts, and then to try to work through them and try to ask for an example. What is this primitive accumulation? What is this violence? What is actually going on here? I don't know in how far that, and I think I'll close on that. I don't know in how far this kind of Marx being present but absent but present has anything to do with your notion of withdrawal. Probably not. And you can feel free to say no. But I would like to talk about it, because I think actually there is such a thing as a Soviet or a socialist tradition. As big of a problem as I have with the term tradition, I think there is something that exists on the level of practice. I think that if there are any texts that were really withdrawn, also to kind of almost save them over for a new epoch of capitalism, maybe it was the texts of Marx himself. And it was done through practices, through certain practices that we can maybe discuss when we go on. So thank you. I hope that this wasn't too rambling with the lack of notes and all that, but
maybe it was a wrong thing to go second. Because I'm in a listening mood right now, and I don't feel like... okay. When I was approached about participating here, I made specific that it's not specifically related to former West subject, but to this art, its discourses, and the world at large. And so it's from this perspective that... maybe it's good to introduce this concept of the withdrawal of tradition past a surpassing disaster. There are certain situations where I think it's not enough to talk about a disaster, but that there need to be a specific category, the surpassing disaster. And if one tries to deal with the consequences of a surpassing disaster, thinking it's a disaster, that's a problem, and I think if, on the other hand, you extend beyond its scope and applicability the concept of surpassing disaster to other kinds of disasters, that's a problem too. You water down and make less rigorous the concept. So it's very important to apply it when it applies. As for those who are interested, as with all of my concepts, one has to be pushed to use the concept. So my general advice, if you ever use or think about using one of my concepts, is no, it's not a surpassing disaster, it's not a radical closure, it's not a diegetic silence over. Oh, but I have to. Okay, it applies, I need it. Again, because I think one of the worst things to do to a thinker is to apply his concept where it doesn't apply, and then it looks sloppy and without rigor. So I'll read a little and then talk a little, and then if you have questions. If the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945, respectively, are a surpassing disaster, then beyond not only the immediate death toll and the manifest destruction of buildings, including museums, libraries, and temples, and of various other sorts of physical records, but also the long-term hidden material effects in cells that have been affected with radioactivity in the depth of the body, so manifest, hidden, but there, and the latent traumatic effects that may manifest themselves après coup, there would be an additional immaterial withdrawal of literary, philosophical, and thoughtful texts, as well as of certain films, videos, and musical works, notwithstanding that copies of these continue to be physically available. of paintings and buildings that were not physically destroyed, of spiritual guides, and of the holiness, specialness of certain spaces. In other words, whether a disaster is a surpassing one for a community defined by its sensibility to the immaterial withdrawal that results from such a disaster cannot be ascertained. So whether a disaster is a surpassing one cannot be ascertained by the number of casualties, the intensities of psychic traumas, and the extent of material damage, but by whether we encounter in its aftermath symptoms of withdrawal of tradition. So it's very difficult, based as a first reaction in relation to any disaster, to say it's a surpassing disaster or it's the usual disaster. I have to look for symptoms for withdrawal, immaterial one, of what seems to have survived the disaster. There is a building, there is a text, there is a library that was not destroyed by the disaster. And yet, a consequence, if it's a surpassing disaster, certain books, certain films, certain paintings that were not destroyed are treated as no longer available. Not by everybody. You see an artist treating a building or a painting or a book as not there. And then you say, but it's there. You see an artist who usually takes classical photographs of buildings. When he takes photographs of other buildings, he does it the usual way. But when he takes photographs of this building, it's out of focus or haphazardly framed. And one way I think of thinking about that is the building is not there. It's not really available. The person sees it, but as an artist, when he takes photographs, he wants them to be in focus. Example I give, Walid Raad's work, when he goes to Central District in Beirut. And as he repeatedly said, he was technically trained to take very clear, focused photographs. He knows how to almost manufacture lenses. And yet, when he went at that point to the Central District, his photographs would come out of focus. So one way of looking at this is a disaster happened. These buildings were spared. We think, thank God, they destroyed all of this, but these 3 buildings survived. And then we look at works that treat these 3 buildings, or one of them, as if they are not there. If that is the case, if I trust this artist, and again, as I mentioned, Boris and I are almost at the 2 extremes of a spectrum. Everybody almost is an artist, almost nobody is an artist. Almost nobody is an artist. Almost nobody can produce a universe that lasts for 2 days. It's unimaginable almost. And when I talk about artists, I have to trust that this is this kind of artist, so that I take what he did as symptomatic of a withdrawal. I take it seriously enough to say the building is there, but it's not there. So to give you an example of another film that does this very nicely, it's a Godard film. It's almost affected by a withdrawal itself. It was for a long time not very easily available. It's King Lear. I think it's now available on DVD. And in the beginning of the film, you hear the producers, Golub, telling Godard on the credits, please, Godard, you have to finish the film by the next Cannes Film Festival. That's the arrangement we have. Then we go to Norman Mailer finishing his adaptation of the script, the end. Then we go to an intertitle that says, and then there was Chernobyl. And then everything disappeared, everything. And we move after that to the main protagonist, is someone asked to recapture the play. It's a very strange film. The producer goes to Godard, says, make an adaptation of this play. Godard goes to Norman Mailer, says, make an adaptation of this play for the film. Then we have an intertitle, and then the rest of the film is this protagonist walking around, hearing people say, it's not King Lear, to be or not to be, to be or not to be. And yet the producers, Godard and Norman Mailer, can go to any library and get a copy of King Lear. King Lear, in that reading, has withdrawn. And so I think one of the tasks of an artist in relation to a surpassing disaster is to reveal the withdrawal, because the withdrawal is not revealed otherwise. The building is there. The stupid play is in the bookstore, not the stupid, very good play. It's in the bookstore or the library. And then I would say the next task of the artist in relation to a surpassing disaster is to resurrect what has been withdrawn. And I intentionally use this almost religious term, just to make clear how difficult it is to do it, and to point out that I'm going to talk about Christ in terms of his definition as the resurrection and the life. So I would say, if you're the resurrection and the life, if you say to someone, Lazarus, for instance, Lazarus come out, Lazarus comes out. Any other person than the resurrection and the life, if he or she says to Lazarus, Lazarus come out, we can no longer ever be completely sure this is Lazarus. That's the difficulty of resurrection. And so one day, 3 hours, 6 days, 50 years later, hopefully never, but it's always a possibility, his sister is looking at him and she says, this is not Lazarus. One day, waking up, doing something, this is not Lazarus. Why? Does he talk the same way? He talks the same way. He walks the same way. He remembers everything, but this is not Lazarus. And that's very close to the Capra syndrome, which you almost get a fictional figure of in the invasion of the body snatchers. Yes, this is not, but this is actually a syndrome. And I think to resurrect, if you're not the resurrection and the life, if you're not the life, to try to bring something back from death, it cannot be done fully. It cannot be done with certainty. And again, there's always this, is it? Not is it, but the possibility that it is not, that it is the double. And so the task is to resurrect what has been withdrawn, but the difficulty is, following the surpassing disaster, you can never be sure that this is the thing itself. So authenticity in that sense, I would say, in relation to tradition, past surpassing disaster, is no longer possible. And it's usually the opposite situation, is you have a surpassing disaster and people say, we took a wrong turn somewhere, we should go back to tradition, we have it all over the Middle East. But this is not possible if there was a surpassing disaster. I would say a third task sometimes is to imply that there is a surpassing disaster. So you make a film, you're Godard, you make a film, King Lear, and in a way we could say Chernobyl is not a surpassing disaster. You make a film, and then I say, why is it Godard feels the need now to make this kind of film? Does it imply that there is a surpassing disaster in preparation? What is it? So I think this is an important task for artists, thinkers, writers in relation to surpassing disasters. Is sometimes they sense the surpassing disaster while it's being prepared. I think most often we wait until the surpassing disaster happens, and then we think in quotation marks, about it. I think this is not what should be happening. So the third task is sometimes making work, implying, so that you look and you say, but there is no clear surpassing disaster, and then you have the task yourself to look, where is it? In what labs in the, I don't know, Tokyo and in the States, some nanotechnology experiments, some quantum computer things are happening that will completely change life in the next 3 decades. And if these lead to a surpassing disaster, you may have someone treating things that are present now as no longer present. Okay. Okay. So I would say Godard, for instance, in relation to Godard and Herzog, who have influenced many filmmakers, producing, in Vertov's expression, quote, films that beget films, end of quote, have also produced films that resurrect films. So that's, for me, important, films that resurrect films. And just to make clear how I use the term tradition, because it's a very ambiguous word. Tradition is not merely what materially and ostensibly survived the test of time. In normal times, a nebulous entity, despite the somewhat artificial process of canon formation, tradition becomes delineated and specified by the surpassing disaster. Tradition is what conjointly, materially survived the surpassing disaster, was immaterially withdrawn by it, and had the fortune of being subsequently resurrected by artists, writers, and thinkers. So this is, for me, my definition of tradition. It's what materially survived the surpassing disaster, but immaterially withdrawn by it. So if there is a surpassing disaster and something materially survives it, but immaterially is not withdrawn, it's not part of tradition. On the contrary, if it's a modernist work attacking tradition and is withdrawn if there is a surpassing disaster, then it's part of tradition. Maybe actually we can open it from now. Yeah, I think so. But just to one last clarification. It's not we who no longer kathak the object, engage with it, can deal with it. It's the object that withdraws. It's the building that withdraws. It's King Lear, the play, that withdraws. In that sense, it's very strange.
Thanks very much. Jalal, I wonder if I can, I'm going to ask an obvious question, which I hope you can respond to in a generous way. have you thought about or considered the possibility that the failure of communism is some sort of surpassing disaster? And I bring that up because I know that Rabbi Murray, for instance, has recently been talking quite a lot about communism within Lebanon, but we could also maybe extend it wider to the Middle East, as in a maybe slightly obtuse way, a third way, in a sense, between religion and the doctrines of capitalism. And certainly the Communist Party during the Civil War, for instance, in Lebanon, had a role to play, there's no doubt, which presumably was transformed at some point after '89. And I just wondered whether you could comment on that at all, or whether that's going too far in making concrete your terms.
I mean, I see that it's possible to put it as a possibility, or possible to put it, okay. But again, you cannot judge something if it's a surpassing disaster except symptomatically. You have to find symptoms of withdrawal. The casualties, the trauma, the immensity of the loss does not by itself say it's a surpassing disaster. So surpassing disaster is not like a value judgment. It's a bigger disaster. It's not a bigger disaster. It's a different kind of disaster. It has different consequences. So 1 million people die somewhere. I can't say in Rwanda it was a surpassing disaster. Unless I see symptoms of withdrawal, then I can say we can't continue dealing with this as a disaster. Terrible, terrible, terrible disaster. We have to switch and deal with it in a different way because the damage is bigger than we think. We think they destroyed most of the library of Baghdad. They destroyed so much of the museum. But at least this book, this thing was spared. But if it was a surpassing disaster, the book, the thing was not spared. It's not available. It's a simulacrum of what it is. And an artist will treat it like that. Some artist will act as if the wonderful thing that we had hidden in the basement, they didn't destroy it, has been spared. No, I treat it as if it's not spared. And actually, that's the reality of the thing. This thing is no longer available. And you have to do this like almost incredible effort of almost like Christ-like figure of trying to resurrect it through your art. And this is the situation of a lot of people after surpassing disasters. They spend so much effort to make available what to everybody else is already available. My God, this is it.
I wonder whether you could talk to that, Dave.
I mean, immediately I'm very fearful after being told, don't use it. I'm immediately already saying to myself, don't use this term, don't use this term. But I think there is an argument to be made that this is what happened with Marx the thinker under Soviet rule, and actually earlier on in Soviet history than one would think. So I think that one could speak about this kind of exactly that situation, that it's there, it's everywhere, it's in every library, it's taught in school. Yeah? But the texts themselves are completely inaccessible. Now you could say, for an example, that it's just because you don't have capitalism as a reference, that these texts are referential, that they're speaking about something, and that something is not there. When it comes back, this is a completely different logic. Yeah? You could say that. But I think the way that Marxism, not Marxism, but Marx, and Marx is, for an example, Marx read not just as a political thinker and an economic thinker, but for an example, attempts to see Marx as an aesthetic thinker are symptoms, maybe, because they come at a time where a disaster is on the horizon, as you said, that there's a sense of what's coming. This is a development of the mid-30s, for an example, in Russia. This is what I was telling you over dinner last night. nice dinner talk we were having about this kind of thing, because it's really like this, yeah, that you have I think Marx was unreadable for people who had at the same time internalized him. Yeah? And it is an incredible, I mean, I don't want to steal your term or misuse it at all. But I'm fascinated by this moment of of also these books being hard to bring back to life, and I mean, this is how I kind of understand these strange strategies that we were using. By I mean, why would you read Marx in English if you've already read him in German or in a really good Russian translation? And we started doing this, I think, in a very symptomatic way. For an example, that we started that wasn't at all reflected. It has something to do probably also with a kind of reflection on colonialism. But what we were doing basically is we were having language lessons with a group of friends where we were reading Marx in English and discussing in English and comparing translations and trying to eke meaning from texts whose meaning was somehow there, and because we were all considering ourselves Marxists and all identifying very strongly, but we couldn't grasp, and we had to resort to some kind of strategy of lifting out of oblivion. I don't know if the model works. Yeah. Maybe you can it's a question.
I think, I mean, exactly. I think it's a question to be tested in a way, which is good for a research congress. Why did you call it Jalal, in the spirit of resurrection?
Ooh, yeah, that's a big. I think. I mean, we used to argue which Jalal, because there are two. So Chernyshevsky, I think for Dima Vilinsky, it was at first Lenin, then Chernyshevsky, then Lenin, then Chernyshevsky. So he was going back and forth somehow. And I was always insisting that there has to be a question mark. So I don't know if that answers the question. For me, it was, что делать is what is to be done. It sounds like a declaration, like this is what is to be done. I mean, for me...
but the Leninist text has a question mark.
To a degree. I mean, he gives a prescription saying that we need professional revolutionaries. That's the point of that text, ultimately. If you identify with that, then yes, you enter on the road of becoming a professional revolutionary. And I don't think art people can... except if there's really a revolution, can be professional revolutionaries. So to me, it's a more anguished question of, like, how can we aspire even to that? Что делать? It's like in Russian, it can be said in a way that sounds quite anguished. Yeah. So I think there's that third meaning of a kind of like of a disorientation and trying to reconstruct in there, but. As I was saying before, I think that the answers that we were getting from the kind of mashup of critical theory readers and, philosophy dissertations and the things that were kind of floating through our context, that this was not enough to answer that question. So I think it's a question that only answers itself in practice. And, I mean, I think that it's actually quite useful to be living through a time where things are really being subsumed by capitalism, where you're really faced with the real problems also of complicity, where you have to ask that question again and again and again and again, like что делать. So, I mean, I hope that the question mark doesn't disappear.